Um, Welcome to this Tools and Solutions webinar, which is organized as part of the Food and Agricultural Commodity Systems Community, formerly known as the Green Commodities Community. So today is our last webinar of the year. And today we will focus on understanding what are the practices and actions that companies can take in the landscape or jurisdiction to ensure they are contributing effectively to prioritize sustainability outcomes. I would like to warmly welcome Patrick Mallet, who's today with us. Patrick is the Innovations Director and founder of ISEAL. And today he will present some of the key concepts, factors, and steps that companies can take to strengthen their landscape investments and actions. So before giving the floor to Patrick, I wanted to ask you if you could introduce yourself in the chat box, so that way we can find out who's joining us today. So if you can type your name, organization, and the location you're joining us from. I also wanted to mention that this webinar is recorded and we will send it out with the post-session email. And lastly, we have interpretation to Spanish. So if any of you is a Spanish speaker and would like to listen to the content in Spanish, please use this interpretation function. So without further ado, welcome Patrick, and the floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much, Alexandra, and nice to see some familiar faces. So I'm going to just share my screen, take you through a fairly detailed slide presentation, but throughout I've got some consultation questions just to get your thoughts and perspectives on what are some of the important factors. And really what we want to do today is dive into, in the context of landscape and jurisdictional approaches, what we see as potentially the important elements that ensure that companies can be most effective in how they invest or take action. So I am going to start with just a brief introduction to the landscape and jurisdictional context, just for those who may not have as deep a familiarity. As most of you likely know, ISEAL represents a broad membership of sustainability systems and traditional certification and accreditation type models. But more broadly, what we aim to do as an organization is to drive effective market-based tools. And what we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years is a recognition that not only is it important for companies to ensure that they have effective and responsible practices within their supply chains, but also that they look at some of the impacts beyond their supply chains. And this often then has taken the context of looking at the regions from which they source. And so landscape and jurisdictional approaches are very much just about how can stakeholders come together within a landscape or jurisdiction to align around sustainability goals and objectives, to align around activities, to find the value add of collaboration, and then what's the role of different stakeholders, including the market, in supporting that process. And so ISEAL's interest in landscape and jurisdictional approaches is that we see that there is a need to ensure the credibility of those processes, particularly in understanding whether actions are having an impact on the ground, and then particularly how those actions and the resulting performance improvements are communicated. So what we've been doing is building out informal collaboration amongst most of the leading landscape and jurisdictional practitioners, so the organizations and initiatives that are actually trying to set these things up, and having conversations around what does good monitoring of actions and performance look like, and what implications does that have on what people can say. And so today's webinar is really an exploration of some of the emerging good practice from those different conversations and the experiences of the practitioners and the leading thinkers in this space. So we'll talk about two main guidances. One came out earlier this year, company action guiding practices, and this is kind of the overarching frame. And then we've started to get into some more detail on some of the specific components of that, which we'll go into. And if we have time for discussion at the end, great. If you have questions and want to put them in the chat box as we go along, that's also great. Maybe Alexandra or Frederica, if chats do come up or questions do come up, if you want to jump in, it's totally informal. I don't see the chat box in my current format. Again, just to give you context for ISEAL, the work that we're doing is really trying to be quite foundational in that we are not landscape and jurisdictional experts or practitioners, but we do have experience that we draw on what credible practices look like, particularly for monitoring, verification, and claims making. So that's what we're trying to bring to this existing landscape of many initiatives that you've probably heard of or even working with, from the framing structures like Landscale and SourceUp, CDP as a reporting framework, to some of the practitioners on the ground like LTKL in Indonesia or PCI in Brazil, to the company networks like the Forest Positive Coalitions of the Consumer Goods Forum. And so the document that we're going to be looking at first is this effective company actions in landscapes and jurisdictions. And this came out in February of this year. And it's really oriented around 4 ridiculously straightforward concepts. If companies are going to be effective at investing or taking direct action in landscapes and jurisdictions, here are the things they should think about. And it's a very short practical guidance. I think it's only 4 pages. So those 4 practices are, what do they need to do to figure out what they're doing, essentially to prioritize which actions or investments they're going to make. And then once they've done that, how can they maximize the impacts that those actions are having? How can they measure progress? So how can they see what is the results that's being achieved, either in the implementation of the actions or performance on the ground? And then how do they communicate the results? Now, of course, those are the simple concepts. Underlying that are some very tricky issues, which we'll get into. So I'm going to go through each of the 4 in turn, and probably not extensively, maybe just pick out some of the interesting points. But when you're thinking about prioritizing action or investment, obviously, companies, particularly at the end of the supply chain, may have supply from multiple or very many different landscapes. And so figuring out where to invest is about where they can have impact. One of the key things that underpins a lot of this thinking and work is around the importance of stakeholders as informing not only where to focus, but the management and the long-term embedding of actions. So, we talk a lot about the role of stakeholder platforms or formal collaboration initiatives that take many different forms. But in this context, it's very much about stakeholders having a role in defining what issues are important to them, rather than a company coming in and saying, we're just going to focus on deforestation or reducing deforestation risk because that's what's important to us. One of those really tricky ones is this last one here, the determining the scale of your investment commensurate with global commodity volumes sourced. So basically it's saying, okay, so if I'm a massive multinational company and I make a small investment in a landscape, is that really sufficient or responsible? And what in fact is the scale of investment needed for the scale of company that I am? In this case, the scale of how much I source of a particular product like palm or rubber or sugar. And so you can imagine the nuance there of what is actually responsible or not, what's commensurate. And there's some discussions happening in places like the Consumer Goods Forum about that. So just a visualization of this first one is giving you a sense of, okay, so I'm sourcing from a number of different landscapes. I may look at a risk lens where they're the highest risks, either to me and my sourcing or to the issues I care about in the landscape, or the issues that stakeholders care about. Where's the biggest opportunity to make an impact? Are there already other activities happening in a space? So looking at all those factors to understand where to source from. In the second one about maximizing performance improvement, this is really about recognizing that one of the key value adds of landscape and jurisdictions is that it isn't isolated activities, that the value of understanding what else is happening in a region and being able to complement that and formally embed projects within a larger structure is important. If you step back and think about, landscapes and jurisdictions are in some ways just a more systemic lens on which to address these really complex, difficult sustainability challenges. So if we look at something like deforestation, it's fairly evident that it's difficult to meaningfully address deforestation on a production unit or enterprise level. And rather, you need to look at this broader geographic scale, but also at the different system factors, whether that's policies that are in place or the political or social dynamic in a place. And so really being able to take that systems lens is important for finding appropriate and longer term solutions. So this idea of embedding activities or interventions in a collaborative partnership, particularly one that engages local government or even has local government in a leadership role, is important for the potential success or durability of those actions beyond project investment. And again, a visualization of this, particularly looking at the aligning of action. So really the understanding of everything that's going on in a landscape and how you can best support that. So the third one, measuring progress. This is one where when we first came to this space of landscape and jurisdictional approaches, not very much work was happening. And it is particularly challenging. My next slide shows a kind of a breakdown of the types of monitoring that we're talking about, some of them more challenging than others. But some of the concepts that are important is, first of all, that not everybody's out doing their own thing. Yes, it's nice to go and measure what's the result of my action, but ideally there's a collective monitoring framework, something that supports the sharing of data and the cumulative knowledge of what's happening in the landscape and how performance is changing and how actions inform that performance. And so you're looking at collective monitoring, but also sharing of results. And so what we recognize is that landscape and making change on large, difficult sustainability issues, be that social or environmental, deforestation, or forced labor, those can take a lot of time. If we're looking at this from a company perspective, it's easier for them just to invest in small, discrete projects within their supply chain. We could be 5 to 10 years in before we're seeing significant, durable change in, let's say, deforestation rates. And so in the interim, what are we measuring? We want to see that there is progress happening. So we want to have a system in place that measures the results of actions that are implemented in the first place. And then for any of you that have any M&E context or background, recognize that it's important also to have a theory of change or a results pathway or something that shows the thinking about, if we see this change based on our actions, it is likely to, or here's the logic we think will eventually lead to the longer term landscape level outcomes that we're looking for. And again, it reinforces the importance of recognizing all of the other system-wide drivers that can potentially influence positively or negatively those sustainability outcomes. And then communicating results is the other one that is particularly tricky, as I alluded to at the beginning. And this is, recognizing that, of course, if you're a company or any other stakeholder, a financial institution, otherwise, that's investing, you need to have some kind of return on investment. One of those returns is what you're able to say either internally or publicly. And yes, there are things in here about the integrity of data, but the main one, the tricky one, is making claims that are relevant and proportional to the actions taken. And so you can imagine that if you are working at a landscape and jurisdictional scale where there's many other things going on, different activities, different changes in the enabling environment, it's very difficult to say we invested in this action and that resulted in this positive sustainability change. Rather, what we need to look at is what are all the things that are going on in that landscape, and how can we show our contribution to those performance outcomes. And again, this, we're starting to see in initiatives like Landscale that they're introducing this idea of results chains or some other way of showing how your action potentially contributes. But then you get into all these difficult questions around, so if there are multiple companies investing in an action or a range of activities, who gets to claim what? Over what time period do you get to claim things? Does everybody claim the whole contribution? If I practically as a company have a zero deforestation commitment or nature conservation commitment, if I invest in a landscape, do I get to claim all of that landscape, all of the hectares or the square kilometers for my towards my commitment, or is there some other way of doing this? And then you overlay that with, let's say, the carbon markets and new and emerging guidance around how companies can claim or not their carbon reduction emissions, carbon emission reductions, and how does all of that fit together in terms of the correlation between their investment or actions and the types of claims they can make. So not surprisingly, in the second half of this consultation, or the second half of this webinar, we'll talk in more detail about some of the nuances within the claims, because that's where our emerging conversations and guidance are going. This final slide here in this first section is just to recognize that there are different types of claims. The simpler of them is to talk about the actions that you have taken as a company. We did this, it's pretty straightforward. A little bit more difficult are progress claims. So this is about just what's happening in the landscape in terms of sustainability indicators. Difficult only because it's hard to get good quality data on a lot of the issues that we care about. But then the most difficult is the contribution claims. So essentially, what is the correlation between the actions we've taken and the progress that has resulted in the landscape? Okay, so that is the overview of that first guidance. You can see it all in detail here. What we're going to do throughout this webinar is, I've set this up in Mentimeter. Some of you may have seen the logo up in the top right, is that we want to, now wait, I can't see this. Does it have a Menti? If everyone goes to menti.com, any of you who are available, does it have a number at the top of the screen? I can't actually see that.
Yes, there is a code.
great. So if you go to menti.com and enter that code, this question should come up for you. And so the question, just while we're waiting, how important are each of these components for effective company action? And I'm going to ask a second question about how difficult are each of these components. But so I've pulled out some of the trickier ones from those 4 basic concepts. And so I'd like you to think about each of those components. If you want to ensure that companies are effective, just rank how important each of those are. And we'll give you a few minutes here.
So for those of you who have never used Menti, all you need to do is go on the website, www.menti.com, and put the code that Federica as well has put in the chat box. You can do it either through your mobile phone or just from your laptop, whatever is more convenient.
And it's quite early in the morning for me. If it's early in the morning for you, I apologize for making your head work so hard.
Patrick, can you just illuminate the final question, claims focus on contribution rather than attribution? That was your diagram now, wasn't it?
Thank you, yes. So the attribution, basically a lot of companies will want to say, we did this and it resulted in that. And the ability to say our action resulted in a significant change in child labor or deforestation or forced labor is challenging in a landscape context. So rather than saying we caused that, we want rather to focus on our actions contributed along with all of these other actions or this other context. So it's just trying not to overclaim.
These good things happened and we were there at the time.
Exactly, yeah. Maybe there's a slightly stronger correlation, but not much. Okay, we're getting some good responses. I'm seeing generally a lot of these concepts are important. And the contribution rather than attribution one is not surprisingly one that's a little bit more challenging and I think still unclear as to what that looks like in practice, which is why we're continuing to have conversations with different groups. So thank you very much for that. We're going to go on to the next slide. I think in Menti you can actually still continue to input in different questions. So we have a second one. These are the same statements, so make it easier for you. But rather than how important, I'm also trying to see if there's a difference with what do you see as the most difficult? What are the biggest challenges to effective company action? How difficult are each of these to do? Oh, and I'm sorry, I should have changed the 2 variables on either end of the scale. So rather than not important at all, this is least challenging to most challenging. I'm sorry if those of you who've responded already. Yeah, that might skew our results a bit. So if this is not challenging at all, that's more on the 1 end of the scale. If it's really challenging, more on the 6 end of the scale.
And I see Sandra has raised her hand. Sandra, do you have any immediate question related to the Menti?
Yes, thank you, Alexandra. This is Patrick from the company perspective.
Thank you, yes. from a company perspective? I mean, in practice, many companies are coming to this fairly blind or new, and so it's really it's almost as much about from the perspective of those who are advising the companies on what they should do. Great. Okay. Again, if you want to continue to input, that's great. I think what we're seeing here now, I don't know how much of this is skewed by my mistake, but it is interesting that in a number of cases, activities match stakeholder priorities, scale up actions, and claims focus, that there's a number of you who are on either end of those scales as to whether it's challenging or not. So I think one of the things we can take, not just from this, but in our experience, is that a lot of this depends on the context in which you're working, particularly whether there's an existing process in place, whether the company has experience in investing beyond their supply chain, things like that. So if we go on to the second half, one of the things that I mentioned at the outset is that ISEAL is really not an expert or practitioner in this space, but what we do reasonably well is bring people together to understand what good practice looks like. And that's what we've been able to do over the last 3 or 4 years in the landscape and jurisdictional space. So these are the organizations that we're currently collaborating with that are formally engaging in the development of these consensus positions. And you can see that beyond our steering group, there's quite a range of different types of initiatives, but many of the practitioners that are most active in thinking about and implementing landscape and jurisdictional approaches. I mentioned a couple here. Transitions, for example, is many of you may not know, but is one of its activities is to coordinate a network of companies on sustainable derivatives. So things like inputs to cosmetics, and so quite actually significant companies in the same scale and context as Consumer Goods Forum or the Tropical Forest Alliance. A number of large NGOs, number of implementing tools, and quite a few practitioners on the ground, as well as some standard systems. But really, we're all trying to figure this out together. One of the interesting things about being engaged in this space is that there isn't a whole extensive body of knowledge about how we do this well. Yes, for landscape and jurisdictional approaches, there is extensive work in integrated resource management and those more traditional types of development processes. But when we think about the multi-stakeholder collaboration and the types of actions and how it gets embedded with local government, all of that is just emerging. And so what we're trying to do collectively is build these consensus positions, which really are foundational and again, very basic, to provide a bit more detail on these critical questions, particularly around the claims side of things. So the diagram on the right-hand side kind of shows the relationship between these 4 elements, where what we're essentially saying is that it's important to know what type of actions contribute or can be considered landscape level actions. How do we communicate about those actions? How do we then understand the performance change in the landscape or jurisdiction, and what's that correlation between contribution or between action and performance outcome? So again, drawing back in that triangle diagram, this slide has a bit more detail than the previous version of it, but you can see how the 4 topics correlate to the different steps that I walk through. Again, the type of actions, the impact that those actions are having, or the results of those actions, the jurisdictional progress, the sustainability progress on the ground, and the correlation between the two. So in terms of consensus positions, we have just literally this week been able to publish the first consensus position, which had 17 of those organizations and initiatives sign on to it. And this one is about meaningful landscape actions and investments. And I think I'm going to ask you a question about this, but the reason we think this is valuable is because we want to be clear to companies when an action or investment counts towards landscape or jurisdictional outcomes. And that's important if we think about then on what basis are companies able to make claims about the either the action, but more importantly, the contribution that they're having to those performance outcomes. So it's kind of a formative piece. And I think some of the things we're trying to inform or promote through this position is that we avoid that companies continue to invest in isolated projects, but rather are more systemic and coordinated about their actions and investments, as well as ensuring they contribute to priority issues. So and somehow this slide looks more complicated than it is. Imagine that there's really just 5 variables. 2 of them are prerequisites that apply in every case. 3 are additional criteria. And so we made this distinction because we recognize that there are things about the action or investment itself that are critically important in all cases. And then there are supporting functions like supporting a multi-stakeholder process or embedding your work in the collective action plan or with local governments. So those 2 prerequisites, the first one, it has a number of subcomponents to it. We want to ensure that actions are contributing to critical sustainability issues and agreed landscape goals. And you imagine this is significant in itself because it implies that those things need to have been figured out. That you can't just go into a landscape and start a project, but actually there has to be some foundation for that. And it has to come through local multi-stakeholder input. So, in an ideal scenario, you've got a process in place that brings stakeholders together and aligns around goals and priority issues. That's not always going to happen. It actually probably most often doesn't happen. You're a company, you're sourcing from a landscape, and you want to start supporting or improving practices. So you think about what kind of actions can I take? Maybe one of those actions is to start bringing together stakeholders in a process. But if you want to get moving on the actions, then at the very minimum, let's make sure that there's some kind of conversation with stakeholders. And ultimately, we can move towards a more formal or structured collaborative platform. And I mentioned in the monitoring context that companies should have an understanding of how they think that their actions are going to contribute to landscape goals. And that'll be important when we come back in our later stage to develop more guidance around contribution claims. And then we want to have monitoring and evaluation in place. And the second one then is that landscape investments and actions aim to have impacts beyond individual supply chains. So this is a tricky one as well, but it kind of says, okay, so if you're investing in actions that support your suppliers, the producers or enterprises that feed into your supply chain, that's fine. That's important. That's not landscape and jurisdictional action. Like that wouldn't help you to be able to claim broader sustainability outcomes beyond those production units or enterprises. So you could work with your suppliers to invest in riparian zones or in buffer zones around protected areas, but that would count because it's going beyond the the farm unit or the production unit. But a lot of these activities are focused on actions that really are much broader than individual suppliers. And so just on the additional criteria, I can mention one other piece. The last one is that actions potentially contribute to broader systems level change. And here it's recognizing how important it is for all of us to essentially have a better understanding and taking account of the context in which we're working. And I know that's a strong message from UNDP and the community here, having that systems approach and systems lens. And I think it's really critical here if we're wanting to have durable long-term outcomes. So easy question first, just to make it a little easier for you. Is it important to know what constitutes a landscape action or investment? So we've put energy into coming up with what we think, and we're doing that because we think it's important then to know whether the action can help inform the types of claims a company can make, particularly around contributions. But it could also all just be a little pedantic. I'm glad you agree. That's nice. We haven't done all this work for nothing. I'd love to see someone say no. Because honestly, if you're a company, you're like, well, we're doing stuff in the landscape or the jurisdiction. We're doing it with our suppliers because that's who we care about. We have to manage the risk and the quality of our integrity of our supply. Why doesn't that count? And I think there are contexts in which it does. Okay, so building on that, thank you for all those yeses. There is a second question, and it is this multi-choice. This one, I'm getting into a bit more detail about characteristics of landscape actions that are most important. So of these 6, how important are each one? And just in case it's not obvious, these reflect the 5 variables that we included in our initial guidance. So we're still very much at the top end. I'm interested, let's see if we manage the time properly. I think if anyone wants to come in with comments, there were, well, now it's going up, but few people had said embedded in collective action plans, not so important. I guess important is a difficult, it might not be the appropriate word. It's not always the case that that's possible. But does anyone want to speak to whether it's realistic that we embed all these actions in collective action plans? For us, it seems like a long-term trajectory, a direction we want to go, but potentially not something that's always in place, or at least even in place very quickly. And please raise your hand or I think jump right in. I think everyone has control of their own microphones. Yeah, Maria, please come in.
Hello. Hi. Thank you, Patrick. I think it's important. I am one of those supporters of the collective action plans, because we've seen here in Ecuador, we have defined a jurisdictional approach for the palm oil in the northern Amazon. And what I interpret, what I understand by collective action plans is the planning, the whole planning of the territory. And I think it's very important to address that and correlate with that, because we have municipalities and another level of government that have jurisdiction on defining the landscape and the planning. So it's not just a project coming, but also the coordination and correlation with the different jurisdictions that have power to define and that work on defining activities, but especially defining, sorry, I forgot the word, but defining the what should be implanted, what should be the vocation for each of the municipalities or the provinces at that level.
Yeah, and I think you raise a really tricky point, which is when you're talking about cross-jurisdictional, who needs to be part of that conversation, who has responsibility, and who gets to make decisions. And there's a lot of politics that enter into those conversations and different interests, but it reinforces the importance of having those stakeholders at the table and having a table in which those conversations happen. Maria, did you want to come in again? I saw you.
Yes, just because these municipalities usually, especially in Latin America, they are in charge of land use. Mm-hmm. So if you don't have, this level of government on board with the projects, they will just be defining different land use while you will still be working on landscape. That will not be possible because they will be granting permits for different activities. So we need that level of correlation and coordination.
Yeah. Anyone else want to come in? I do want to make one other note, is just to recognize the little hump on the not important at all to have impacts beyond individual supply chains. I think this is I would agree with that. My feeling is that it is important, but I can also see the case why, when companies are investing in their supply chains, that some types of those activities should count towards their landscape impacts. And really it's about where are you able to draw a correlation between the types of activities you're investing in and the longer term sustainability outcomes. Let's keep going. I've got one other section, and this is because we've already, as a community, started working on the second topic, which is about communicating progress on landscape actions or investments. So this is recognizing that in the short term, the results that we are likely to see are much more about the short-term outputs or potentially outcomes of the activities that are being delivered. And so these are just a few examples from companies that are actively engaged in landscape and jurisdictions on the types of things that they are saying. Now, these aren't specific to, we could get to a specific landscape and then you'd have more specific quotes. But, for example, PepsiCo investing in landscape initiatives that support, and then you've got all these sustainability outcomes: conservation, community development, smallholder inclusion, responsible production practices. So they're already communicating about their intent to influence those sustainability outcomes. And so then it's about, and what kind of investment and how can those investments tie to those outcomes? So when we think about, we've already got a draft that is still internal, but one of the goal, first of all, is that we're trying to understand what are the guiding practices and key concepts underpinning credible action by companies. And so, as with all of these consensus positions, we're taking a very high level, right? These are 2 or 3 page documents in this case that are setting out guiding practices, almost like principles of here are all the things that need to be in place, recognizing that initiatives like Landscale are already developing more detailed practical implementation guidance for what does this look like, what are companies able to say about their actions. So it's important because we want to create that incentive for companies to be able to talk about what they're doing even before performance outcomes come about. We want to ensure that there is that step taken to correlate actions to outcomes, but without the outcomes, we need some framework for saying, okay, well, what is it that supports the credibility of claims around the actions? So can we credibly link actions to outcomes or to performance results? And so we've come up with this initial list, and this is really almost more the consultative element of the conversation today, because this is very much an initial list. It's quite broad. It's a little overwhelming probably to look at this, but I will talk you through these different elements. So these we're suggesting are the types of things that both need to be in place and that ideally companies are able to communicate about. Now, obviously, if you're making a short claim about your action, you're not going to include all of these things, but they're the types of things that should at least be thought through by companies. Obviously, the characteristics off the top are just, what's happening, how extensive is it, when's it happening, over what period of time, basic information that's sort of always in place. Understanding whether it's what stage it's at, is this being implemented now, is it something that's going to happen in the future, is it individual, is it just me doing it, or is it part of a collective coordinated effort of companies? We start to see these more and more in landscapes where companies come together or brought together to coordinate their actions. And then a few almost more principles or characteristics that the actions are relevant, that they are likely to achieve the intended sustainability outcomes, that they're proportional, so the scale of investment in relation to the scale of company sourcing is appropriate, that they're additional, that this isn't something the company's already been doing, but it's actually a new activity, and durability. So thinking about how this action is embedded in the landscape and with local stakeholders. And then a couple of supporting pieces, performance monitoring. So we talked about that in the previous concept. The baseline performance monitoring is in place. I think the important thing here, actually, we haven't talked about before, is this baseline. So recognizing that even if performance change takes time, it's important to know where we started. So what's the baseline against which we can measure change over time? And that actually requires us to have thought through, what are we measuring, and how does that inform our results? Safeguards policy, I think, is something that has received increasing attention over the last 5 years or so, just recognizing that some of these actions can have unintended consequences. There's trade-offs between a lot of these different sustainability issues. If you say, well, our primary objective is zero deforestation or net zero, great. And let's look at the impacts that's having on communities within the landscape, particularly smallholders or indigenous communities, and make sure that we're not unduly affecting them. That kind of ties to local accountability, this idea that it's important to coordinate and work with local stakeholders. And then just right at the end, verifiability as, okay, so if you're actually talking about the things you've done and you've got information about it, let's make sure that that information correlates to what's happening on the ground. And we don't have a lot of experience in what's necessary or sufficient for how data or actions on the ground get validated. You can imagine it's everything from satellite monitoring of deforestation to of integrated conservation areas, to actual field level checking of the implementation of activities. So that's a lot. I know we've had a lot of content. Let's see if you've got some energy left. I've got 2 slides. I've broken that last slide into 2 columns. And again, it's a how important one from the perspective of companies. How important is it for companies to communicate this information? So sorry, I said from the perspective of companies, I don't mean that. How important is it for companies to communicate this information? So if you as a stakeholder, just take your perspective, and companies are reporting on their actions, how important is it that you know about each of these things? So it's from your perspective. And we've got 6 here and then 5 on the next slide. And then your job is done. Phew. Yeah, it's not surprising that relevance is right at the top. And thank you for everyone who's participating and responding to these questions. It's useful to see, and I think with Alexandra and Frederica, we'll make sure the slides are shared. And what's nice about this is that we can PDF the results of these questions as well. So you'll see these responses in case that's useful for your own work. So it's interesting, you got some waves in the whether action is individual or collective. Not surprising. I don't think that's the most important thing. It's good to encourage collective action, and the actions are actions. It's important to know who's the subject of the action, I think. Let's go on to the last one, which is, again, as I mentioned, just the next 5. Okay, so these are the last 5 from the previous slide. Again, from your perspective, imagine that first response was too quickly, but let's hope it doesn't skew things too much. Unless, if someone did say none of these are important, I would love to hear your thoughts about that. Please, you're welcome to come in. Interesting that currently, at least, the how actions are verified is quite high. I see it's dropping down a bit. See, that's the problem. Always with a lot of people, the averages just sort of even out. But actually, what's nice about this is when you get different humps, you can see that there's differing opinions. Yeah, safeguards has a longer tail. That's interesting. Just to think, okay, I don't think we have a lot of experience. I was recently at the RSPO roundtable in Kuala Lumpur, and from my perspective, the critical issue that permeated the discussion really was this trade-off between stakeholders who emphatically want zero deforestation and the need to hold the ground on NDPE, no deforestation, peat, exploitation, and others who recognize the necessity of smallholder development, livelihood, security, and the trade-off that comes there, particularly if you think about high forest cover countries. A number of certification programs say you can't develop or exploit high conservation cover countries. Well, if you're a government in that country and landscape and jurisdictional approaches trying to work with and embed actions with local government, it's not a really easy sell to say, yeah, you can't actually improve the livelihoods of your constituents. So that trade-off is going to be really important to think, okay, well, what is acceptable? And I'm interested to see how the conversation develops. So we have just a few minutes left. I know, Alexandra, I think you wanted a couple of minutes at the end to talk about. So probably that precludes any kind of discussion. This is still an open questions. So if you, as Alexandra, pass it back to her, if you want to put any thoughts, either specific to the question, any other information that would be important for companies to include, or any other thoughts that came up, you know, we'll see those. And if you have questions, we can answer them. And if you want to put anything in the chat, we can also answer them after the fact. But I'll pass it back to Alexandra. And I really want to thank you again for all your input, and hopefully some of this information was useful for you.
Thank you, Patrick. Also throughout your presentations, there were like several comments coming in the chat box. They were mostly related to the collective action plans and their relevance. We'll make sure to share those with you so you can see them in details. And also there was one specific question that came from Stephanie, who's from a Partnership for Forests. And it was around landscape level monitoring tools and frameworks. So maybe, Stephanie, if you're still around, we can respond to this question just at the end, or we can follow up after this webinar. But with this, I wanted to thank you all for joining us. As mentioned just at the beginning of this session, this is our last webinar for the year. I invite you all to check regularly our digital platform. If you are not there and you haven't joined it, please, we invite you and encourage you to join it. We can support you with having your profile there. This way you can stay in touch and find out regularly about all the events that we have. And we're planning many of them for the next year. And surely we'll be organizing something else with ISEAL as well. Thank you, everyone. And we wish you a great day, and we'll send out an email with the recording of the session and the presentation.
Great. Thank you all. Nice to see you.